All right, so we want to discuss today the morality of war. Down through the ages, we've had countless wars throughout society, but the question becomes, is there such a thing as a good war? Many people have referred to the Second World War, for example, as a good war, one that needed to take place because there was a terrible tyrant that needed to be put down. On the other hand, in more recent years, from the Vietnam War forward, we've run into the fact that there are countless numbers of people who are challenging the idea that any war should be fought, that war in and of itself is something that we should try to avoid at all costs. And so this introduces what in philosophy is referred to as just war theory. Just war theory wants to attempt to minimize the reasons for fighting, to try to work through every possible scenario before we're able to get to the point where war becomes a necessity. War should be the last resort, but it argues that there are times when it is necessary. So it wants to limit the means with which communities are able to fight. Now, within the context of just war theory, there are two important concepts, jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Jus ad bellum is the justice of war, resorting to force, right? Saying that war is justified, that it is an act of justice as a way of forcing individuals into compliance. And jus in bello, justice in war, which is talking about the conduct of the participants in war. This is why, for example, we have certain codes of conduct that soldiers are expected to adhere to. The idea being that a person engaged in an act of war should meet under certain specific circumstances and should uphold a certain code of honor. This is one of the reasons why, for example, the Second World War was considered by many to be a just war because of the way that Nazis were treating certain human beings. Their conduct in war was not appropriate. Well, it's important to remember that jus ad bellum and jus in bello are separate terms. War can begin with a just cause, but it can potentially proceed very cruelly. Or alternatively, war could begin unjustly, but be fought in a poor or immoral fashion too. There is a connection in terms of this. So war is something that might begin with a just cause. We see that human beings are being mistreated. We want to put an end to that. We've tried proper negotiations, but they've failed. And so what does that leave us with? Well, it leaves us with the need to go to war to force compliance. But in doing so, it's important to make sure that we do not regress into the crueler side of war to where our treatment of the enemy becomes just as bad as what they are doing that we're trying to stop. So it's important to remember that a war could begin with very good, just causes, but over the course of time could transform into something that is very cruel. And so we could meet the condition of jus ad bellum, but violate jus in bello. To be a just war, there are 6 major criteria that must be put forward, and this is something that is stated specifically in this rather interesting book. I'll put that where you can see it, Brian Orend's The Morality of War. And within this text, he says that there are 6 major criteria that have to be met. First, there has to be a just cause. Secondly, there must be right intention. Thirdly, there has to be a proper declaration by a proper authority. Fourthly, it must be a last resort. Fifthly, there has to be a probability of success. And finally, there's proportionality. And so we're going to look at each of these in turn. But just to reiterate the list once more for you, just cause, right intention, public declaration by a proper authority, last resort, probability of success, and proportionality. Now, we look first at the concept of it being a just cause. Just cause largely means self-defense from aggression. Just as we as individual human beings have a right to defend our own person, likewise a sovereign nation has the right to defend itself. And so if there is an aggressor that is attacking your way of life, then there is that sense in which you have just cause to fight back against it, to try to reclaim what is yours. So international law says that a nation can defend with force if it is attacked. It also says that it can defend other countries if they are attacked. So not only do you have the right to look out for your own sovereign interest, but you also have the right to look out for the interests of other nations. Sometimes people complain that within the United States there's a sense in which the Americans are policemen of the world. And there might be some element of truth to that, but that doesn't mean that the actions are not unjustified. If a nation is aggressive towards another nation, such as Iraq was towards Kuwait, then there is a right that we can intervene and act on behalf of that other nation. Coercion, aggression, drive for dominance, these are the major causes of an unjust war. When someone wants to claim more territory than is theirs, for example, when Hitler annexed Austria, that would have been a very good opportunity to have said, your actions are unjust. Something needs to be done. But of course, because of all kinds of historical factors, there was appeasement going on, and Hitler was able to maneuver far better than what he should have been able to. Without that policy of appeasement, he probably could have been stopped without quite as much bloodshed. But when we have people trying to force a specific way of life onto others, when we have acts of aggression taking place, when we have a nation that's trying to gain more territory and imply dominance over another, those are the reasons why we end up with an unjust war. The core principle of aggression is mentioned in this text, and I wanted to read the actual wording here. The core principle of aggression, the commission of aggression by an aggressor, A, against any victim, V, entitles V, and or any third-party vindicator, T, acting on behalf of V, to employ all necessary means to stop A, including lethal force, provided that such means do not themselves violate human rights. So, lethal force can be used to stop the aggressor by the victim or by a third party acting on the victim's behalf. The aggressor forfeits their right not to be attacked. And this is how we defend without violating. Okay, so the individual who has made the maneuver, the person who wants to attack the other, that is the person who is in the wrong. That is the person who is waging an unjust war. And it becomes necessary then for that other nation to try to defend itself, to try to defend its borders, or for other parties to become involved to try to act on behalf of that sovereign state. When that happens, the aggressor is going to be attacked, but their act of aggression in the first place is what has led to that act. And so by initiating that aggression, they have lost their right not to be attacked. Okay, that's the basic idea. Now the question again becomes, do we fight the aggressor or do we appease them? And as I said, appeasement was a policy that was tried in the 1930s prior to the Second World War, and it was disastrous. because it effectively, people had no desire to get embroiled in another war after the First World War. And so there was appeasement towards Germany. And the Nazis were allowed to get away with a lot of things that they should not have. So appeasement really does produce a lot more problems than it does good. And so generally the answer of fight the aggressor or appease them, the answer is to fight them. But sometimes we know that it's futile. And that leads into another question, that of right intention. We have to act for the right reasons. Why are we fighting? Well, we're fighting to overcome evil. We're fighting because there is a force out there that has to be fought against. And this is better than being forced towards the battle, or because you have a desire to gain glory or anything of that nature. And so when you see some force of evil out there in the world, when you see a violent aggressor, someone who is opposing and attacking the rights of the individuals, then there's a duty to try to prevent that from taking place. And so you're fighting for the right reason with right intention. If you're doing it just because you're seeking glory, you're looking for an opportunity to become a big individual, to gain fame and fortune for yourself, then that's not a good justification. That's not a good reason. In the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna, the great warrior, is supposed to go into battle against the Kurus and to reclaim the kingdom that was once his family's, but now has been lost, has been usurped. The power of the Kurus had grown dramatically, and they had become very, very corrupt in their ways and had oppressed the masses. And so it became necessary for Arjuna and his family, the Pandavas, to try to reclaim that territory. So they had just cause in going forward. Now, Arjuna, of course, he didn't want to go into battle. He didn't want to fight. He thought that it was wrong to do that. But Krishna explains to him that he has a duty, he has a sacred duty and obligation to go forward and do this. And he explains to him, that one of the reasons why you are the right person to fight this battle is because you don't want to do it. You realize that there's no point, and Arjuna makes the statement at several places, that there is no point in going forward, fighting this battle, if all I'm going to do is stick a crown on my head. That doesn't serve any value. That doesn't serve any purpose. There has to be a genuine reason. And Krishna points out to Arjuna that you understand that it's not about glory. It's not about getting something for yourself. It's about overcoming the evil and bringing back the good. So you shouldn't involve yourself in war unless you can commit to the proper rules of conduct and also war termination goals. So if you're going to get involved in that war, you're going to want to make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons and that you're willing to follow the basic rules of conduct that are established, and to also understand what is it that's going to bring about an end to this war. What is our actual result that we're looking for? Hopefully, an end to the hostilities. Hopefully, better conditions for the masses. But is that what we're after? But make sure we understand what the war termination goals are. The third criteria, public declaration by a proper authority. That's a fairly obvious situation. Wars are not supposed to be conducted unless they have been properly declared. You have to inform the enemy of your intent and give them a final chance to avoid war. And so by saying that we are going to declare war upon this nation, these are the reasons why, and that's what a formal declaration should do. It should explain, these are the reasons why we're declaring war upon you. This not only says to that nation, fair warning, this is what's coming, but it also says to them, the nations of the world have recognized that there is a fault, that there's a problem, and you have to find a way of fighting against that problem. Can you fix this internally and thereby avoid the act of war? Because again, while war may be sometimes inevitable, it may sometimes be necessary, we should desire to prevent it. But we have to desire to prevent it in such a way that it is fair and just to all involved. We can't, as in the case of appeasement, we can't just say, okay, have it your own way over and over and over again, because that's not going to make things better. But if we fairly declare, this is what we intend to do, we are going to begin war with you if you don't stop these actions. It gives that nation the opportunity to fix their problems. In essence, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, that is not exactly a formal declaration of war. It's a notice of separation from a sovereign power. But the basic idea is still the same. It's saying to the king, these are our list of grievances. This is why we feel that you are such an oppressive individual and why we need to fight against you. And so it is, in a way, a declaration that war is coming unless you correct your ways. Many people did not want to separate from Britain. Many people would have preferred to have remained loyal to the crown, but they didn't want to continue going on under the oppressive rule that they had at the time. And so they fought against it. But by issuing that declaration, it also listed, here's what our complaint is. We're not just going out and attacking you because we want to, or because we feel like it, or because we're glory seekers. We are attacking you because you have attacked us first. And if you will stop the actions that we oppose, then we can avoid the war. And so that's the reason, that's the purpose for public declaration. The fourth criteria is the idea of last resort. Diplomacy is always better than warfare. If there is a way that through negotiation we can resolve the problems without blood being shed, then that is clearly the better way to do it. And so we should try to enter into the fray. We should try to negotiate with that sovereign nation. We should try to negotiate to get these issues resolved before resorting to an act of war. Dr. King, for example, during the Civil Rights Movement, his list of criteria, one of the first things he said was that if there is a complaint about racial issues and problems in a particular city, his committees are going to go in there, they're going to investigate, make sure that those complaints are true. And if they are, the first step is to sit down with city leaders and try to find a way of resolving those issues. Try to work out a timetable of change so that the issues can be resolved peacefully. Now, if those conditions are met, then everything is resolved and there's no problem. And if not, then it becomes time for direct action, things like sit-ins, marches, and so on. King, of course, always advocated a peaceful approach no matter what. He would not have moved towards violence. But the point was just to demonstrate that even in a situation like that, where we're not talking about a sovereign nation attacking another, but individuals within that nation, you still have the same issue. Let's negotiate first. Let's try to find a peaceful solution first. And then we can move on to something more if we have to. But diplomacy becomes the key to try to bring about change. Negotiations, threats, economic sanctions, these things should come first. Now, negotiations, clearly, that's an important thing. but escalating a little bit, threats implying that if you don't do this, war will probably come. It's not yet a declaration, but it gives them something to think about, that maybe you're willing to take it that far, and that might bring about change. Economic sanctions is something that this nation uses a lot to bring pressure onto a foreign power to try to yield them to your ways. Again, that becomes a way of maybe waging economic warfare, but still saving the bloodshed. And many people consider these things to be best, but not everybody. Why? Well, because things like economic sanctions and threats specifically could violate the rights of individuals within those nations. It could potentially do harm to non-combatants. And it can also give the enemy more time to entrench its position. And so if I spend a lot of time trying to make negotiations, and that foreign power knows what's coming, they have no intention, perhaps, of yielding, but they'll keep up those negotiations as long as they possibly can, because that allows them, while that's taking place, to be able to continue to build up their arsenal, to train more soldiers, to make more plans, to get themselves more battle ready. And so it produces more time. And so some people think that instead of the last resort, that war should come quicker to bring about an end, because in the end, it might produce a shorter war. When you talk about things such as economic sanctions, this is something that could potentially harm non-combatants or violate the rights of individuals within the nation that you are supposedly trying to help. There is a basic rule of war, which is many times, probably most of the time, not adhered to. But the basic idea is that the war should only be amongst combatants, soldiers fighting soldiers. The civilian population should effectively be left out of it. Now, of course, we know that throughout history, this is something that doesn't really happen. Take, for example, Sherman's March to the Sea during the Civil War in 1864. Sherman goes from Atlanta towards Savannah. 60-mile wide swath of land is being burned, is being destroyed. And so civilians, people who are not engaged in the battle, their homes are being burned down, their property is being looted, the livestock is being taken by the soldiers for food, and what they can't take is just being slaughtered, simply to punish the population of that land. And this is the type of mentality that we find in war a lot, is that people will attack not just the combatants, but the civilians too. And within the context of just war, the civilian should not face harm. But yet, even through these issues of economic sanctions, it can bring problems to that nation that could lead perhaps to a loss of income, the ability to take care of individual selves, the loss of ability to get health care, the loss of individuals to even be able to feed themselves. And so there is that problem that we face that every time that we engage in these acts, such as economic sanctions, it can do harm to civilian populations. And that is something that, again, those who advocate for a just war theory would be opposed to. But nonetheless, most individuals would argue that despite these problems, the idea of going through the process of negotiation, making the threat of war, introducing economic sanctions, these are all things that most people would argue should be tried first before we actually declare a proper war and go into it. Because if we do, then clearly many, many lives are going to be lost. The fifth criteria is that there has to be a probability of success. What this ruling tries to do is to prevent or ban futile resistance. You have to consider the odds of victory. Now, odds are just that, they're odds. We never know for sure who's going to win, who isn't. But we can look at it and say, okay, this particular nation has a massive army that is well trained. And on the other hand, this one has a small rabble of individuals who have no training, who maybe have inadequate weapons. It's pretty obvious who would be victorious in a situation like that, at least without outside help. I mean, again, going back to the American Revolution, you could see that the British Army, the British Navy was very well traditioned, very well stocked. They were well trained. And the American militiamen had very little training. Most of these people were off of the farm. Some of them had never shot a rifle before. Others had only shot for hunting purposes. But they were not well trained. They were not in a position where they would be able to really fight back. And so, if it wasn't for the intervention of other nations such as France and the Hessians coming in from Germany, there probably would have been a very different outcome to that revolution. So, we have to make sure that we're weighing the options to say, is there a possibility of success? Now, the odds of victory may not be an absolute, but yet people will sometimes choose to fight anyway. But it's important to consider the odds that can be known, the choices that can be made. You have to think about things like this all the time. You don't want to go into it recklessly, because what is the point of throwing away lives? Now, there are instances where, again, because of the violations that are taking place, because of the great harm that's being done, you will have people who will fight back, even under circumstances in which they know they're going to lose. You can look at the Warsaw Ghetto uprising during the Second World War. And there's an example where you've got this massively well-trained and armed and equipped Nazi force going up against this group of Jews from the ghetto who are simply standing up and fighting because of the horrible way that they've been treated, trying to make some kind of change, even though they recognize that it's essentially futile. Sometimes people are pushed to that point where they're going to fight no matter what. But generally speaking, and particularly when we're talking about sovereign nation against sovereign nation, the idea is that you want to make sure before you wage this war that there is a reasonable probability of success. And finally, the last criteria is called proportionality. Proportionality considers universal benefits of acting against universal costs. And the benefits have to outweigh the casualties. It's really a very utilitarian type of decision. You have to weigh the pros and the cons. You have to weigh the benefit of what we're going to receive if we're victorious against the costs, not just the financial costs of waging war, which can be quite considerable, but also the cost to life, the cost to the individuals waging that war, as well as, of course, to the civilian populations too. And so there has to be a sense in which the benefits are going to outweigh the casualties. Well, how do we determine this balance? Again, it's a very utilitarian concept. I want to provide the greatest good, the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people. But how can I determine that balance? Well, it's simply a matter of weighing up all of the options, trying to crunch the numbers and see what comes up on top. Towards the end of the Second World War, President Truman made a very difficult, very agonizing decision in which he chose to unleash the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, Truman understood in doing that in his action would produce a tremendous amount of pain and suffering. He understood that 60, 70,000 of the enemy would be destroyed through that act, that this island would be devastated, or these islands rather, would be devastated, that there could be no life on them for many, many decades to come because of the radiation that would be left behind. But he also understood that if he dropped those bombs, Japan would surrender. They would see the power that the United States had, and they would bring an end to this war. If he didn't do it, then this war would have become a land war in Asia. Never a good idea. And it would have lasted another year, 2 years, with millions of casualties on both sides. Neither option is necessarily great, but Truman made the utilitarian choice of what is going to provide the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people. And that is, in this particular case, to unleash the bomb, because it's going to end the war immediately, and in the long run will save huge numbers of lives and allow the world to start to get back, to where it should be, rather than this constant state of war that it had been in since 1939. And so it was not an easy decision. It was a difficult decision, but he understood that by weighing up those options, it was really the only viable option. It was really the only moral option that could be taken. It was necessary in order to bring an end to this war under favorable terms. Because while we have a tendency to talk a lot more about the aggressions of the Nazis, the aggressions of the Japanese were just as bad. And the Germans had already surrendered. So the Japanese were the ones who we had to turn our attentions to. And so it became necessary at that point to find a way to bring that war to an end in a favorable fashion. And that's exactly what Truman did. And that's what's meant by proportionality. The benefit has to outweigh the cost. And so essentially, if we want to consider a war to be a just war, it has to meet all 6 of these basic criteria. It has to be a just cause. There has to be right intention. There has to be a public declaration by a proper authority. It has to be a last resort. You've tried everything else. There has to be a good probability of success, and it has to be proportional. If it meets all 6 of those criteria, then we can consider it to be a just war. If it violates even one of those criteria, we would have to consider it to be an unjust war. And so through this little talk today, you were able to hopefully see what it takes to imply the idea of a just war, one that should be fought, one that has the right or even the necessity to be fought, as opposed to one which does not. War, again, is not about gaining glory. It should not be about practicing aggressive tendencies and taking over more territory or imposing your will upon others. It should be a defensive action intended towards preserving what is right and fighting against what is evil. And so if those conditions are met, it could be argued that we have a good war.